Today's guest is 900 pounds, 3 feet tall, and sits on the top of the roof. Who do you think it is? Welcome to the Shades Cahaba Oral History Project. I'm your host, Sean Wright. When you step into Shades Cahaba Elementary School today, you're greeted by a large owl that has been expertly crafted in commercial linoleum on the floor right inside the doorway. On the walls of the lobby are large, colorful owl illustrations that are framed in shadow boxes. When you walk the hallways, you'll start to notice the owls on classroom doors, on the decorations in the hallways, and on the shirts of the children you pass. You will notice flyers for events such as the Owl Prowl, a race that starts and finishes at the school and takes a short lap around the Hollywood neighborhood. If you are a first-time visitor to Shades Cahaba Elementary School, then this is the first time you realize that the owl is our mascot. But why the owl when there are many other options, such as the Patriots, the mascot that Homewood High School students chose when the new school system and high school were built? From the time the school was built in 1920 until approximately 30 years later, an owl stood watch over the students as they walked into the school. From a perch on the highest gable above the original front door on Hollywood Boulevard, this 900-pound, approximately 3-foot-tall cast concrete owl would look down on each student as they entered the school. It was called a symbol of learning to all who enter here. The owl was a big part of the school. The yearbook was called The Owl, and an early student newspaper was called The Owlet. During the 40s, a group of Shades Cahaba High School students who called themselves the Owls Club planned and put on dances at City Hall for the students. Now, not everything was about the owl. The athletic team mascot was the Mountaineers, or Mounties for short. One of my favorite photos is of Coach Piggy Mitchell wearing a shirt that says Shades Cahaba on the top, Mountaineers on the bottom, and has an owl image in the middle. Now, most would find this confusing, but for those of us in Alabama, we're used to seeing this. Our largest universities have a combination of mascots and slogans that don't have anything to do with each other. Auburn University uses tigers and eagles, and the University of Alabama is called the Crimson Tide and has elephants. Now, I attended Shades Cahaba in the early 70s, and I had no idea that the owl was a thing. There were no owl images in the hallway or on the floor. We didn't have an owl yearbook or owlet newspaper. It just wasn't a thing. You see, there was no owl on top of the school. So where did the owl go? To answer that, we need to go back to the last days of Shades Cahaba as a high school. During the 1940s, Shades Cahaba was grossly overcrowded. There were students in classes K through 12 in less space than there is now. Student population in the 1940s was well above 1,000 students. I have a hard time even imagining that. Since the 1940s, Shades Cahaba has added a considerable amount of space by finishing in the courtyard, adding a gym, and then later on classrooms on the east side of the gym. By comparison, today's elementary student population is in the low 500s, half what it was in the 40s. By 1944, citizens of Homewood were mobilized to push for a new high school in Shades Valley. And I don't mean to ruin the surprise, but they got it built. The class of 1949 was the last high school graduating class at Shades Cahaba before the move to the new school. A big push was made to keep the name Shades Cahaba, but for whatever reason, the name Shades Valley was chosen. They continued to be the Mountaineers, and they kept the red and black team colors, which they use to this day. But back to the owl. It was removed from the roof about this time. Now, this is where the story starts to go in different ways. I've heard that the owl was removed so that it could be transferred to the new Shades Valley High School, but they didn't want it. See, while Shades Cahaba had the owl to welcome you to the building, Shades Valley had the tower with a clock in the front. The yearbook was even called the Tower. I'd also heard that there was student hijinks involved. In the class of 1948's 30th reunion newsletter, called The Mountaineer, it was written, "It seems that teeny boppers of the late 40s would splatter a fresh coat of paint on the owl every Halloween, and the officials had the owl removed." Some people believe it was stolen, but I have a hard time imagining a 900-pound owl could be removed from the roof without damaging it. Whatever happened, the owl was placed in storage and forgotten about. Sometimes during my middle school years, I was roaming my neighborhood with some friends when one of the guys wanted to show us something. We headed down Wellington Road and then went into an overgrown area between two homes. There in the middle was this huge owl on a short pedestal. It was then that I learned of the owl at Shades Cahaba. Just a few years later, in 1978, the owl was returned to its perch on top of Shades Cahaba Elementary School, and the explosion of owl pictures and decorations descended on the school. And when I started this podcast, the story of the owl was going to be an episode. I started asking around, and everyone had a different story. A lot of time has passed since the owl was replaced on the roof, and even more since it was originally removed. Memories have started to fade, and people who were part of the story are no longer with us. I decided to set the record straight, and all it was going to take was talking to a few people who might know the story. This is going to be easy, right? Well, I asked author Cheryl Sumi, who wrote the book Homewood, A Life of a City, how I could go about finding information.
You sort of go back to the newspaper or whatever published source there was from the time as the definitive source, and they thought that the owl came down and it was going to be moved to put on Shades Valley High School, which seemed to be but then it sort of somehow got lost. Whether anybody stole it or not, who knows? You would never know.
When I was looking for stories for the podcast, someone recommended that I talk to former kindergarten teacher Laura Estes. It seems that Laura lived next door to the owl. Could it be her father's? Former Homewood Board of Education President Nick Ardillo? Would she know the story?
Well, my dad built the house that we lived in on Wellington, and Mr. Ferris lived next door, an older man. What I heard was he found out that the owl was in the storage at the maintenance department and got it and had a platform built and put the owl on there. And then he kind of had a little circular garden around it, real pretty, but then lots and lots of trees. And so you had to know it was there to know it was there. I was 12 when we moved there. I would get a book and a blanket and go sit under the owl and read. It was wonderful. So then Mr. Ferris died. I don't know the exact time. So I started in Shades Cahaba in 78. And at that time, my dad was on the board. He may have told someone at the board, oh, by the way, the owl is right next door to my house. And they moved it. Now, also, and I don't know where I read this, but that when it was a high school, the seniors would take great thrill in getting up there and pouring paint on the owl as a senior prank.
I had just about decided to post what I had and then update the story in a Sean Wright was wrong episode in the future. Then I decided to reach out to Dale Turnbow. You see, Dale is the daughter of Louis Levon, who was principal during the time the owl was returned. Maybe she would know. Dale had been a staff writer at the Birmingham Post-Herald back in the 70s. Just my luck, she had written an article on the history of the owl. She gave me an approximate date of the article, and after a short search on microfilm at the Lynn Henley Research Library, I found what I was looking for. Now, for you kids who might be listening, microfilm is where you have to go when the internet fails you. You'll have a greater love for the search feature on your computer. When on microfilm, you have to look at every single page on every single day just to find the article you want. Dale's article coincided with the 57th anniversary celebration that was being held at Shades Cahaba. It seems the owl had just been found. Of course, some of us already knew about it. According to Larry Ferris, whose grandfather, James M. Ferris, was at one time the superintendent of the Jefferson County Board of Education, the reason the owl came down was because
They were tired of having to clean the owl every year by Halloween pranksters. I guess the thing had 15 or 20 gallons of paint dumped on it.
Larry's grandfather saw it in storage, and he asked the board what they were going to do with it. They didn't have any plans, and he either bought it from the board or they gifted it to him. He took it to his home on Wellington Road, cleaned it up, and put it in his garden on the side of the house. And that's where it sat for the next couple of decades. After Larry's grandfather died, he sold the house and lot to Ed Landman, a Shades Cahaba alumnus, and then Larry sold the owl for $75 to Bert Lindbergh in October 1976. Now that the owl had been found, the anniversary committee had high hopes for getting the owl back on the roof of the school in time for the celebration. But Mr. Lindbergh had other ideas.
I don't blame them for wanting it back, but I've got it and I want to keep it. I still intend to move it to my home and I'm not interested in parting with it.
Lindbergh said that the owl is a
one-of-a-kind thing. No one does that sort of artwork anymore.
Mr. Lindbergh had plans to take the owl to his home on Shades Mountain and place it on a pedestal overlooking the city below. Now that would seem like the end of the story until the class of 1948 got involved. The next year was the 30th anniversary for their class, and they had plans for the owl. I will let class president Herb Griffin tell it from here.
I understand how we got the owl back. I don't know whose hands it was in, but we had a Shades Cahaba reunion committee, and one of the influential members of that committee was Jesse Todd, who ran Mrs. Todd's cafeteria. You remember
Yes,
that? Yeah,
I remember that.
And supposedly Jesse and several, maybe a lawyer or somebody, several influential members of the committee went to see the person who had the owl and suggested very strongly that he present it to the school. And I don't know, I don't know how big a stick they used, but anyway, they convinced him that he needed to, even though he purchased the owl legitimately. It was his owl, nobody doubted that, but they suggested it would be in his favor if he would return that to the school, and he did.
There was a lot of excitement about the owl going back up on the roof of Shades Cahaba. Homewood Board of Education Superintendent Bill Cleveland was a student, and he remembered it well.
Well, I remember it was a big deal. We all got to go out into the what was the front of the school, because that is where the office was. As a matter of fact, where the current office and main entrance is located now didn't even exist when we were there. It was, you remember, it was almost like a big courtyard in the back, and the entrance was right there by the horseshoe. And so I remember all of us going out to that area and the crane hoisting up the owl, and we had a big ceremony about the owl returning back. Yeah, it was pretty memorable.
Well, there you have it, the story of the Shades Cahaba Owl. Hopefully we got all the facts right. If not, you'll be hearing about it in the future. And many thanks to Laura Estes, Bill Cleveland, Sue Grogan, Herb Griffin, Cheryl Sumi, and Dale Turnbow for helping me piece the story together and answering my repeated questions as new information came about. Now, this will be the last podcast for 2019. We will take a break for the holidays and return the first or second Tuesday in January. We have a lot of episodes about Shades Cahaba planned, as well as some special episodes about the other schools in Homewood and other Homewood-specific stories. The decade of the 2020s is a big year for the Homewood schools, and we want to share those stories. I'm hoping to hear from more people who have a story to share. People like Herman Maxwell. I've heard from a lot of people who enjoyed my talk with Herman. That episode would not have happened if Herman hadn't reached out to me. Now, if you have a suggestion for a story for the podcast or something for the blog, reach out to me. You can find my contact info on our website, shadescahabahistory.com. Thank you to everyone who supported me in the podcast. I look forward to learning more about the history of Shades Cahaba and Homewood and sharing it with you on the Shades Cahaba Oral History Podcast. The Shades Cahaba Oral History Project is sponsored by SeanWrightArt.com, featuring Shades Cahaba Oral History Project shirts, hoodies, and accessories. There are products featuring our exclusive Shades Cahaba Centennial logo based on an owl yearbook image from the 1920s and 30s. There are also sweatshirts and hoodies which features an interlocking SC that was found on the basketball team jerseys from the 1920s. Products purchased in the store helps us to offset the cost of producing and publishing this podcast. You can find a link to the store on the podcast homepage at shadescahabahistory.com. Subscribe to the show at Apple Podcast, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you subscribe to your favorite podcasts. You can also listen directly on our website at shadescahabahistory.com. If you like the show, we would appreciate it if you would rate us at Apple Podcast and share the show with your friends.